Last night on Truth Social, Donald Trump made a post saying that we were calling off all negotiations with Canada as the result of an ad that was placed by the Canadian government, specifically the Ontario government, and that shows Ronald Reagan taking a stance against tariffs, something Donald Trump didn't like. Now, I'm going to play you immediately this full ad right now, and then we'll talk about the response, Trump's response, Doug Ford's response, the Premier of Ontario who paid for this ad, as well as some analysis after that.
When someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. But over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs. Throughout the world, there's a growing realization that the way to prosperity for all nations is rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair and free competition. America's jobs and growth are at stake.
So that's the full ad. Now let's take a look at what Trump had to say about it and what's led to this escalation of the tensions between Canada and the US when it comes to trade, the response from the Ontario Prime Minister, as well as the full speech from Ronald Reagan, where we can see, okay, there might be some reason for frustration here, but perhaps not a ton of it. At around 10 o'clock last night, Trump posted that the Ronald Reagan Foundation has just announced that Canada has fraudulently used an advertisement which is fake featuring Ronald Reagan speaking negatively about tariffs. The ad was for $75 million. He says they only did this to interfere with the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court and other courts, and then he emphasizes tariffs are very important to the national security and economy of the USA. Based on their egregious behaviors, all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Signed, President Donald J. Trump. And then we can see the statement here from the Ronald Reagan Foundation saying that they learned that the government of Ontario, Canada created an ad that used selective audio and video of Ronald Reagan delivering his radio address to the nation on free and fair trade. We'll look at that document, that transcript in just a second, dated April 25th, 1987. The ad misrepresented the presidential radio address, and the government of Ontario did not seek nor receive permission to use and edit the remarks. They say that the foundation is reviewing their legal options on this matter, and we encourage you to watch the full unedited video. Then this morning, Trump came out and said at 7:20 a.m., Canada cheated and got caught. They fraudulently took a big buy ad saying that Ronald Reagan did not like tariffs when actually he loved tariffs for our country and its national security. Canada is trying to illegally influence the United States Supreme Court in one of the most important rulings in the history of our country. Canada has long cheated on tariffs, charging our farmers as much as 400%. Now they and other countries can't take advantage of the U.S. any longer. Thank you to the Ronald Reagan Foundation for exposing this fraud. Make America great again. Obviously, the big punishment that's being laid on Canada for the buying of these ad slots by the Ontario Premier is that, well, trade talks have ceased. But as a Canadian who's been following this very closely, the political environment in Canada, this isn't as much of a punishment as you may think. Currently, Canada hasn't been in much serious trade negotiations with the U.S., pushing that forward to a later date. I'll tell you the details there. First, let's get into the response from the Premier who bought these ads, as well as the transcript from Ronald Reagan's address, the original one. In the midst of this controversy, Doug Ford, the Ontario Premier, went on Twitter at 8:08 a.m. this morning and said, Canada and the United States are friends, neighbors, and allies. President Ronald Reagan knew that we are stronger together. God bless Canada and God bless the United States. And then, interestingly, he links to the original address, sort of saying, hey, if you think that I was lying about what was inside of this video, well, then go watch the video for yourself. Let's look at the transcript of this very video and talk about how it's a little bit reasonable to be frustrated, but also it could be seen the other way. And I think both sides have a point here. Here's the transcript. The whole point of this address is to explain to Americans why Ronald Reagan was imposing tariffs on some Japanese products in response to Japan's inability to enforce their trade agreement with us on electronic devices called semiconductors, an important industry back then that's become even more so today. Now, while it's clear here that Reagan is imposing tariffs, he does make clear that he doesn't like the idea of them. He loathes to take this step. He's going to mention the sound economic reasons for implementing this, but that over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. This is one of the clips that was used in that commercial. He outlines how much he doesn't like tariffs, but at the same time says, yes, we're using tariffs now to achieve a specific goal. Here specifically saying, in imposing these tariffs, we were just trying to deal with a particular problem, not begin a trade war. So next week, I'll be giving the Japanese Prime Minister this same message. We want to continue to work cooperatively on trade problems and want to very much lift these trade restrictions as soon as evidence permits. Then a section that was used in the television ad, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports. When someone says that at first, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. You remember this from the ad. He then makes the very good point that the result is more and more tariffs, higher and higher trade barriers, and less competition. The most important thing to recognize here is this competition point. Many people will make the argument that if you too much emphasize the domestic industry, then that domestic industry doesn't need to compete with the international industry, meaning that perhaps it becomes less competitive on a technological standpoint or even from a price standpoint. But at the same time, in a world where other governments are tariffing similar national security sectors and perhaps are subsidizing them very heavily, well, then it gets a little bit more complex here. And Reagan closes this address saying, in my meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan and the Venice Economic Summit coming up, it's terribly important not to restrict a president's options in such trade dealings with foreign governments. So Reagan seems to be making the argument that while he's against tariffs at large, that these targeted types of tariffs for specific trade issues, well, that's a tool that the president should be able to use. Now, saying that Ronald Reagan actually loved tariffs for the U.S. and its national security, I think that's a little bit of a stretch when you just take the look at this transcript. But there is reason to be frustrated here because the Canadian ad is a little bit of a misrepresentation, especially given the fact that the address was about imposing tariffs. Now we get to what I think is the most interesting angle of all of this, what this means for Canada and the U.S. Many people, a lot of articles, are framing this as a sort of existential growth in the tensions between Canada and the US. Now, I don't think so. As a Canadian who very, very closely follows Canadian politics as well as the Canadian economic policy brought forward by the Canadian government, I think that this is a little bit more puffed up than it needs to be. The current Canadian stance, certainly over the last month, has been, well, we have a good relationship with America. This is from the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, saying, well, we're not going to reach any kind of major trade deal here with the U.S. Instead, the Liberal government and Mark Carney have been framing this as, you know what, Canada has the best trade deal of all countries with the U.S. right now, given their shift towards this more protectionist policy. So the Canadian government's stance has been, well, we're not going to retaliate in any extreme way. We're not going to even focus on reaching a major trade deal in the short term here. We're going to set our sights on a year from now when the major US, Mexico, and Canada trade agreement will be renegotiated. So in the short term here, there was no major trade negotiations actually happening. So when Trump says that, well, we're going to cut off all of these trade negotiations, that's really only talking about very, very specific negotiations that actually are ongoing. The actual negotiations that have been going on have been between Dominic LeBlanc, who's been in the U.S. largely talking with the U.S. counterparts, not about any broad tariff relief or any broad trade deal, but specifically about the steel and aluminum and energy industries, likely also talking about auto manufacturing. These are some of the industries that are actually suffering from tariffs as it stands now, because these tariffs that are being implemented on Canada are very targeted at this point, at least the ones that the Canadian government have been worried about as of late. And as of earlier this week, Dominic LeBlanc, the Canadian Trade Minister, well, he's been pushing back on the idea that we were even close on getting any kind of relief for these specific sectors. He told reporters in Ottawa that he was surprised by a news report which said a deal with the Trump administration could be finalized in the next few days. He said, actually, that's not the case. We're still talking about things. So the one who's responsible for putting together this deal said that, hey, we're actually not all that close on coming to any kind of deal for these very strategic industries that are admittedly being hurt dramatically by the targeted tariffs put on them by the Trump administration. And from a federal government perspective, this kind of tension between the US and Canada could actually play out in their favor. Bear with me for a second. If you're not familiar with what's going on in Canada, the Liberal Mark Carney government, the Prime Minister of Canada and his party, are trying to pass a major budget in the next 2 weeks. A budget that has been quite controversial. It will be very large in terms of the size of the deficit, one that is the largest outside of the pandemic era in a generation, looking towards putting hundreds of billions of dollars over the next numbers of years towards more defense, as well as spending in other critical investment areas. This is how they're framing it, that they're going to be putting billions and billions and billions of dollars to try to grow the Canadian economy, largely by the government getting more involved in it. This is the idea, an idea that some people say is a great idea, and some people say, well, I'm a little bit skeptical that this kind of spending is in the best interest of Canada. All this to say, there's controversy in Canada right now about this upcoming budget. And just a couple of nights ago, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, gave a primetime address to all Canadians at 7:30 p.m. on their TVs, say about a half-hour speech talking all about the importance of passing this budget. And a lot of the rhetoric inside of this speech harkened back to his campaign days. A lot of messages about we can't trust the U.S. anymore. We need to stir up this kind of Canadian nationalism. We can't trust the U.S. That relationship is over. A total shift from where we were even just a few weeks ago when we saw Mark Carney meeting with Trump and it all seeming very jovial. So in my eyes, this increased trade tension could actually help out the Canadian government dramatically. Right now, this canceling of the trade talks that Trump is doing, well, it's not all that substantial because there weren't really trade talks going on apart from these critical industries we've just talked about. Now, at the same time, being able to have a big news splash about all of this increased tension with the U.S., even though nothing really substantial has changed here, that does help out the Liberal government in making their argument for getting support for this budget, this historic budget with historic investment, but also historic spending and historic deficit spending. Now, if one were to put on their tinfoil hat and look at the positive relationship between Carney and Trump and look at this situation, you might think, okay, well, is this some sort of coordinated response between the two governments to help the Liberals get this large investment or spending bill passed in the next month or so? If you had your tinfoil hat on, a little bit of a conspiracy behind the scenes, perhaps you would think, okay, this doesn't change anything when it comes to trade negotiations, and it helps out the Canadian government, which seems to have a good relationship with the Trump government. I'm not sure that I would personally go that far, but this is some of the sentiment that I'm seeing and some of the speculation that I'm also seeing. But whether coordinated or not, this is something that will help the Canadian government pass this major bill, as it will likely stir up more of this anti-American or America versus Canada competition, or this tension that has been growing, albeit dying down over recent months, but now brought back up again as we get closer to this budget passing. Now, do I think anything really meaningful will happen in terms of these canceled trade talks? Not really. Everything is set on the sights of a year from now when we're going to be talking about the updated CUSMA or USMCA agreements, potentially a major reshaping of the way that North American countries interact in terms of trade. That's where everyone's sights are right now. So in the short term, these changes and all of this noise just kind of feels like noise to me. I don't know. What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments. What have I gotten right here? What have I gotten wrong? What have I missed entirely? Let me know what you think. Subscribe to the channel. It doesn't cost you a dime and helps me out dramatically. But with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.